Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from John's first chapter. We're going to be breaking, or after this, we'll have broken it down into 3 lessons, the first of which is verses 1 through 18. We added the title, The Word Incarnate, so there we meet the Word, which is a reference to Yahshua. He was in the beginning, before the beginning. He was pre-existent, he was with God, he created all things, and he was the source of light and life and everything else. And then he came and pitched his tent among men. So the Word, the divine entity, inhabited the frail human flesh in the form in order to reveal him the fullest and most final revelation. And we're just going to read one verse from this. For the law was given through Moses, the grace and the truth came through Yahshua Messiah. Verse 17. So he is the new Moses of sorts. Moses was and remains the preeminent figure of Judaism. The Jews revere him as the model saint, but Yahshua indicates a new dispensation. The 5th dispensation was that of the law. The dispensation we are now in is grace, and so that's not to suggest that there was no grace prior to his coming. And neither is it to suggest that the Torah or the law is obsolete if he came to fulfill it in Matthew 5:17, also the 17th verse. Does that mean that it is still an operation and effect? And the answer is yes and no. There are 3 main categories of the Mosaic law: the ceremonial, the moral, and the social. The ceremonial included the animal sacrifices. That is one and done finality. He was the atonement, capital A. So henceforth, all animal sacrifices are obsolete and unnecessary. The moral law, which is derivative of the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments, remains eternally binding. We Christians are obligated to honor, observe, and obey it. And then the social laws, because these were the secular laws that formed their society, and because the ancient Israelite society was at radical variance between most modern societies. Some of them are valid, some of them are not necessarily so, but they are all useful to study for the underlying principle underneath them. So Christians have a lot to gain by studying the law. And then the next section, the next lesson we covered was verses 19 through 38, or 37. We're going to take off from 38 to 51 today. But here we meet John the Baptist. So John starts from the beginning, before the beginning. No mention of his birth or childhood. He is just pre-existent. Before anything else was, he was there. And then we meet John the Baptist, who was priests and Levites ask him, "Who are you?" They came to investigate because he was a man the likes of which Israel hadn't seen for some 400 years, a prophet. And that's nowhere indicated in John's text. And he confessed, and he did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." So as the religious rulers of Judaism, they had the right and the responsibility to investigate people who had messianic claims, because there was no shortage of these people running around. Yahshua was not the only one, and there was rumor and mystery as to who precisely this man was. He was a spiritual Messiah. Most of the messianic pretenders were of the militant variety, but he confesses and he does not deny. And then they ask, "Are you Elijah?" And he came in the power of spirit in Elijah, but he was not literally Elijah reincarnated. And he was a prophet. It's interesting because it says, "Are you the prophet?" And that would have been a reference to Deuteronomy 18:15, where Moses frankly foretells of a prophet who will come after me. Listen to him. And that is the prophet. John was a prophet, but he wasn't the prophet. And then they want to know who he is because they have to answer to the ones who sent them. And he said, "I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of Yahweh, as the prophet Isaiah said." So this is common to all 4 Gospels. Isaiah 40 verse 3, this was his point and purpose. He came in the wilderness, that was the desert, so he was a recluse and an ascetic, and he was a voice of prophecy, a voice of fire and brimstone preaching, but his entire purpose was to pave the path and point the way to the Messiah and who comes after the one coming after me, verse 27, who has become before me, whose sandal straps I am not worthy to loosen. So the one who came before him, now John was born 6 months in advance of him, and yet he acknowledges that he came before him. He acknowledges his pre-existence. John the Baptist, at least in John's depiction, was aware of his pre-existence or his divinity, and he considered himself unworthy to even do a slave's or servant's menial task to him. And then the previous lesson consists of 3 days, and what takes place in this is actually on the third day. On the next day, verse 29, John saw Yahshua coming toward him and say, "See the Lamb of Yahweh who takes away the sins of the world." So who is the Paschal Lamb, the Passover, the sacrificial lamb? That was the nature of his messiahship. It was to come as the suffering servant, to be the propitiation of our sins. So he is the fulfillment of the typology of the Exodus. In John, verse 32, and John bore witness, saying, "I have seen the Spirit coming down from the heaven like a dove and remain on him." So this is all, now the fact that John baptized was mentioned, but there's no mention of the Savior being baptized, but we recognize the Ruach coming down in the form of a dove from his baptism accounts in Matthew and Luke and maybe even Mark. So that is as close as he comes to the reference. There is earlier mention that I baptize in water, but in your midst. So he was not baptized. Eventually we read that. And the Spirit is confirmation of his divinity. We witness the Trinity in tandem in the event, at least in Matthew and Luke's account, we hear a voice from heaven, the Father, expressing his approval. "This is my only begotten in whom I am well pleased." And he sees and witnesses that he is the Son of Yahweh. And then the following day, verse 35, we're going to read verse 35 and 37 without commenting, then launch into verse 38 to start the lesson itself, because this takes place on a specific day. And the following day, John was standing with 2 of his disciples, and looking at Yahshua walking, he said, "See, the Lamb of Yahweh." So the reason I included this in the original frame was this is the repeated declaration of the Lamb of Yahweh, and I emphasize the details of that role and that function more thoroughly than we are going to be able to get into in this lesson. But these 2 disciples, we'll find out who they are soon enough. One of them is the author. But John, identifying John in the passages of John is an interesting task. We don't have time to get into it. And then the 2 disciples heard him speaking, and they followed Yahshua. So they ceased being his disciples. The disciple is one who mimics and models the pattern of the master. They had found a new master, and John couldn't have been more thrilled, because what do we read in 3:30? He must increase, I must decrease, so that he may increase. So he had the attitude of abject humility and subservience, which all who point the way and pave the path for him to come into the hearts of others must be similarly oriented. Verse 38, lesson itself. And Yahshua, turning and seeing them following, said to them, "What do you seek?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which translated means teacher, "where are you staying?" So the 2 are not exactly named yet, but we find out that they are John and Andrew. These are 2 of the 3 of the top tier of his disciples, the 12. These were the inner entourage, the other member of which was Andrew's younger brother, Peter, and they were disciples of John the Baptist originally, but they found a new master, and he wants to know, who do you seek? And they call him Rabbi. He was not officially or formally educated. He was not a product of the Jewish schools or institutions, but he did refer to himself as such. He was a rabbi and a teacher, and they want to know where he's staying. And the Son of Man, even the foxes in the ground have places to lay their head, but the Son of Man was essentially a homeless, itinerant preacher. He relied on the charity of others throughout the duration of his 3-year ministry. He was technically and strictly speaking homeless. He said to them, "Come and see." And they went and saw where he was staying and remained with him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. So he invites them to find out for themselves. Come and see. This has evangelical emphasis in here. Come, it's an invitation, and see for yourself. you will witness what I am witnessing to you now. All you have to do is come. So in the evangelical formula, we have to invite and witness so that other people can witness, because disciples exist to make disciples. We want to be in the business of multiplying the church by multiples, not by addition. And, sure enough, they saw him and they stayed with him. They were attached to him from now. And the 10th hour would have been about 4 o'clock p.m. in the day. So that gives us our frame of reference for when this happened. So whatever happened earlier than 4 o'clock. Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of the two who heard from John and followed him. So Andrew was the older brother of Simon Peter. They were fishermen by vocation. And the calling, this is John's version of the call. Every gospel order author records something similar in Matthew's 4th chapter and Luke's 5th and 6th, I think. But Mark says it in the 1st chapter. And the two other was John, and they followed him. That's what disciples do. They follow and mimic and live with and learn from a master. So they were, for all intents and purposes, latched onto him for this. First he found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which interpreted is the anointed. So Andrew has a similar witness that John the Baptist. John the Baptist outright testifies of his divinity. He is the son of Yahweh, but the Messiah would have been likened to them. They did not come to the awareness of his divine incarnation immediately in the total gospel picture. So the Messiah, there was references in Micah 5:2 that he was to be from eternal. So it's pre-existent, just like John's account, but also Genesis 3:15, he was to be born of a woman, and he was both. But the Messiah was the long-awaited expectation. The Jews are still waiting for their version of the Messiah. They have not fail to accept him as the fulfillment of their Old Testament prophets. But Simon was a Jew, and he had an instant awareness, and the cause and effect of having a testimony is to testify. So he shares the knowledge that he has with his younger brother, Peter, who actually eclipses him in ministerial activity, though Andrew would have been connected to the inner entourage, which concluded John as well, and John had a brother by the name of James. They were the sons of Zebedee. So John never mentions himself by name. He refers to himself as the beloved. That is a self-reference. And he brought him to Yahshua, and looking at him, Yahshua said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Peter," which translated is a stone. So a lot of the disciples had a birth name and a given name. Levi was born Levi. He became Matthew. That translates as gift of God. And Simon became Peter, which translates as rock, or Cephas in the Aramaic or Hebrew, one of the two languages. But he was to be the rock. And in the gospel portraiture, he is not yet the rock. He is impulsive and irrational at times, and courageous but careless. It's not until the book of Acts where he realizes his full potential. So when the Savior, he doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the call. Everything is gradual. You have to be patient. You're not going to get instant results once you become a Christian. You have to work at it. But also we read Nathaniel is one of the disciples we meet eventually. He is of the next group of disciples, and he is mentioned in tandem with Philip, but in the other gospel accounts, he is Bartholomew is the one who is linked to Philip in their tandem of presentation. So it's not impossible that he was Bartholomew. He had two names. But Peter, and even Matthew, he used his gift as a tax collector. He was methodical and organizational to write a semi-systematic account of the protagonist's life story and meaning of his ministry. And Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So I actually just learned that Andrew and Peter were denizens of Bethsaida, and Philip was a Greek name. Alexander the Great's father's name was that. So by this time, the Greek and Hellenistic culture had clearly influenced even Jews, but he's from the same town as Andrew and Peter. We don't meet all the 12 right away. This is the initial call. John doesn't record. I think all the synoptics record the call of Matthew as something separate from the original, and Judas is never presented, and a lot of them are anonymous and obscured and barely mentioned, if at all, outside of the list in which they are in. But we do, Philip is also the one who is approached by the Greek Jews in the 12th chapter of John with a question, and they use his Greek name, these Grecian Jews who were in town for the Passover on the week that his ministry was consummated on the cross. They approached Philip because he had a Greek name. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him whom Moses wrote of in the Torah and the prophets, Yahshua of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So Philip has an instant awareness. He perhaps received his witness from one of the two, because Andrew spreads the message to Peter, and then Philip is the next we read. So this might have been a chain reaction, and he spreads the message to Nathanael. So already the disciples are multiplying. They were 1, now they are 3, and eventually 4. We have so he recognizes the fulfillment of the Mosaic law and the prophets. He came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Remember Matthew 5:17. So every picture of the Jewish Old Testament, every typology and every prophecy is fulfilled in him pertaining to the Messiah. And the Jews, for a variety of reasons, I'm not an expert in the Jewish, not formally educated in Jewish theology, but they interpret it differently. And but he is of the son of Joseph. Now this is not a denial of the doctrine of the virgin birth, to which we are indebted to Matthew and Luke as the providers thereof. Joseph was his legal father, his stepfather, but he was not his natural father. And Nazareth was the town from whence he hailed, not in which he was born. Bethlehem, we learn in Matthew's account. And even Luke's. That was the location of his birth, fulfilling Micah 5:2. We already alluded to the eternality alluded to in that prophecy, but it's also gives the specific location of his birth. And Nathanael said to him, "Is it possible for any good to come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." So Nathanael is skeptic, and he is skeptical and prejudicial because he's looking at the town he's more worried about where he's from than who he is. From the mean, obscure, ordinary towns, he spent the first 30 years of his life in solitary anonymity and obscurity, but then he burst out into the scene and he's just getting started. And Philip says the same thing that we read earlier, "Come and see." So he's echoing the Messiah's evangelical invitation, and we too have to invite others to come and see for yourself. Don't just take my word for it. You got to find out for yourself. I don't want you to have my testimony. I want my testimony to build your testimony. Yahshua saw Nathanael coming towards him and said of him, "See, truly an Israelite, in whom is no deceit." So the word deceit is alternately translated as guile or dishonesty. So he recognizes his moral character and caliber and qualities instantaneously. As soon as Nathanael comes and see, Yahshua can see past Nathanael's skin. He can see the word in flesh. He might not know it yet that it is the word in flesh. But two human beings looking at each other, he sees the one who was prophesied and he was led up to, and this is the one they've been looking for all these centuries. He is the answer to their prayers and the promised deliverer. But Yahshua has subterranean insight. He sees, weighs, and judges us according to the motivations of our heart and spirits. Man looks at the outer flesh, Yahweh judges the spirit, and what is true of Yahweh is true of Yahshua. That's 1 Samuel 16:7. in reference to David, who was also Bethlehem born, and it was promised to him that through one of his descendants would be the Messiah. Nathanael said to him, "From where do you know me?" Joshua answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." So I don't remember reading a fig tree in this translation, but I have encountered it in other translations. So he has instant awareness, much as he pre-exists. He can see before there's anything to see. And he wants to know. Nathanael is perplexed. How do you know my name? How do you know who I am? How do you know that I'm an honest person? And he answers him and says, even before Philip called you. And this fig tree would have meant something significant to Nathanael. He would have remembered it. It would have been a recent memory. And he would have connected it into his mind and come up with the calculation that this man is a prophet. He has subterranean insight. He weighs the moral internal qualities of mine. And he knew that I was under this fig tree. This is clearly someone above and beyond ordinary, extraordinary, and special, and in fact unique. Nathanael answered and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the son of Elohim. You are the king of Israel." So he comes to the correct confession. That's a 180 reversal. Priorly, he was skeptical. He said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? This town of poor people, this obscure desert outpost in Galilee. And, well, it wasn't quite desert, but he recognizes that he is the son of Elohim. So he does, in this account, have an instant awareness of his divinity. John the Baptist earlier identified him as the son of Yahweh, and both are correct. He is Elohim. He's more specifically the son of Yahweh, but he is Elohim himself. And Elohim is a team, 3 members, Father, Son, Spirit. But the king of Israel, so he knew that he was the Messiah. The king of Israel was one of his titles, and that's ultimately what compelled the Romans to reluctantly consent to the Jews' request for crucifixion. They said he made himself king of the Jews, and then Pilate interrogated him in the 18th chapter in John's, and he says, "My kingdom is not of the earth." So Pilate wants to clean his conscience, but the mob is baying for his blood, and that's the Jews indicted him for blasphemy, but the Romans could care less about this. So what they used against him was this title, King of the Jews, as evidence of sedition. Joshua answered and said to him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. Do you believe? Greater than that you shall see." So he's just getting started. He is not finished with him. The road ahead is going to be exponentially better. So he's just introducing himself to him at this point. "I knew you were in the fig tree." That means something to him. He would have recognized the fig tree where he was at that point. And greater than you shall you see. So greater than that shall you see. So he hasn't even shown him the fullness or harnessed or utilized the full potential of his prophetic and miraculous powers. You ain't seen nothing yet. And this is also can be a paraphrased colloquial translation of verse 51, which is the final verse of this chapter. And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, from now on you shall see the heavens opened, and the angels of Elohim ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." So he saw the fig tree, and he heard him say the fig tree that he saw, but he himself will see the very heavens open, and the angels of Yahweh will both ascend and descend. So they go up. This reminds me of his ascension, and there are 2 opposite directions: ascension and condescension. So he was originally from the heaven, from the beginning, with God, was God, at all, etc. But then he condescended in the form of the flesh, and pitched his tent among men, became one of us. And then he ascends back to him. And the Son of Man is a title that is used 83 times throughout the gospel. It is a self-reference with origins in Daniel, but 13 times in John's gospel. and the gospel itself does get better. So we really you ain't seen nothing yet. And if you are new to Christianity or curious about even coming, I can tell you right now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Doesn't mean your life is going to get better, but the Christian joy is not dependent on circumstances. We take comfort in relief, and the one who controls all circumstances, even when things don't go our way or as we would like. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.